right. All right. Afternoon, folks.
Hello.
Trying a little bit of a different setup here today because I only have two hands. So, be all right if I make you host?
Yep, that's fine. I watched yesterday, so I know what you're gonna do.
Oh, perfect. Where are we?
It was pretty fun.
Here we go. It's a little complicated to do it on camera, I have to admit.
And you didn't burn down the museum.
I did not burn down the museum. I'm all prepped with extra water today,
Not yet.
just in case. And so we should be 100% fire safe. There's also a fire extinguisher over there.
Oh. I'm sure there's other precautions you have.
Oh, yeah. So we shouldn't need all of that, but it's there just in case we need it. It should be all set here. There we go. Find my right combination of sticks. And modern stuff. Okay, yeah, it's all here. We're good. It's actually quite a large bundle of stuff here to go over. So try to keep some of it off the camera so that it doesn't look too disorganized.
None of it's as heavy as a skull, though.
No, none of it is anywhere near as heavy as our woolly mammoth over there. It's actually all pretty light and easy to carry. The hard part with most of carrying most of it actually is keeping it dry.
Oh yeah.
As like we'll talk about more of this stuff. You got to have less than 10% moisture, or all it does is spin.
Yeah.
So yeah, there you go. So I heard my little alarm go off there, but we can give it another minute, see if anybody else makes it, or if it's just going to be a small group today.
Good.
And we'll get started. The should be sharpen up my little implement here. We're gonna try to make fire by banging two rocks together today. I haven't actually had much success with that, I'm afraid. But a little bit of luck, we'll get it to work today. So, all right, well, yeah, time keeps on moving, so we'll go ahead and get started here. And if anybody else pops up, we can catch them up. Now, first thing before we get started here, do you happen to send marshmallows to the museum for me? Because I've got my marshmallow stick ready. Okay. Nobody ever sends me marshmallows. It's a little heartbreaking. So today's program is fire by friction. Now, we're going to actually go over several different methods of starting a fire, not all with friction, but they all go through the whole process. They're the same kind of things. If you haven't been to the previous programs, my name is Sean, here at Colossal Fossils. Thank you for joining us. Now, what I do for the museum here is what we call experimental archaeology. That is, well, it's a really fun job. As you can see, I get really into it. Experimental archaeology is kind of a neat type of science. Now, archaeology is the study of people from the past. Experimental archaeology is doing an experiment based on something that they left behind to try and figure out how it works. Today, it's going to be fire. Use stone tools, leather, clothing, fire, the whole deal. to better learn and better understand how our ancestors, how primitive people survived. Now, saying they're primitive people is, it's not really a great way to describe it, but that's how most of us understand our ancestors. They were actually very intelligent, as you're going to see from some of the stuff they figured out just with making fire. They really knew what they were doing. Now, I'm going to make sure we have time for questions at the end. So if you got a question, go ahead and hang on to it, or throw it up in the text, and we'll make sure that we get your questions answered. I will, I don't want to say, I will tell you at the end of today's program, you'll know how fire by friction works and a couple other methods works. It's really, really tricky to go out and do it. So if you do try it, of course, parental supervision, we don't want to light anything on fire. Fire safety is very important. If you do try it and you don't get it to work right away, don't be discouraged. It took me 6 months of practice and trying and tweaking before I got my first friction fire. Now, 15 years later, I can usually do it pretty quickly. So I'm going to make it look easy. It's not that easy. Don't get discouraged. Now, fire safety, very, very important. Today, I am here inside the Colossal Fossils Museum because that's where our camera equipment is. I would really like to be able to demonstrate this stuff outside, but it's wet, it's windy, it's cold. Computers don't like that. If this was an in-person demonstration, it would be a little bit differently. So I'm actually sitting here on the floor of the museum next to my bear hide and my cave paintings. And so we're not actually going to light a complete fire here in the museum. Talk to the fire department, the mall management. We assured them we're not actually going to have a fire drill today. So I have a fan going, good ventilation, and lots of water surrounding me here, also a fire extinguisher. If you do practice any of these methods, if you try to learn how to do this, which again, I encourage you to experiment, do it safely. Make sure you're outside. Parental supervision is important. Fire safety is very important. Fire, though an important aspect of our evolution and a very useful tool, can be dangerous. Now that said, what is fire? If you go into your school and you talk to your science teacher, you tell them that fire is a high-speed oxidation reaction. It is an exothermic chemical reaction. It produces plasma. Your science teacher is going to be really impressed. Hi, everybody. But your science teacher doesn't need, your primitive ancestors, your ancient early man does not need to know that fire is an exothermic oxidizing chemical reaction to start a fire. So remember that if you can. Don't worry about it. You don't need it to make your fire and roast your marshmallows. Now, what fire needs, because it is an exothermic oxidizing chemical reaction, is 3 things. It needs fuel, something to burn. It needs heat, which is what we're going to be producing here, and it needs oxygen. Fires like us, if there's not enough oxygen, enough air, it can't breathe, it can't do its thing, because it's actually the oxygen that makes the fire burn. If you know what rust is, like a rusty piece of metal, that's the same kind of thing as fire, but really, really, really slow, and it doesn't produce heat. So without further ado, we're going to start working on some fire. Now today, fire is super easy. Any grocery store or gas station, you can get yourself a handy dandy portable piece of fire, right? Now, this, if you were to go back in time and show this to an Ice Age ancestor, they would think you were from the spirit world. You were one of the gods. You were magic, shaman, right? All you have to do to light your little kudlik is take your magical piece of fire and light it up without spilling out any of the oil. There we go. And then you've got fire. It took a second, but it was super easy. Now, that's not how we're going to do it. That's not how we're going to do it at all, because it's way too easy. Our ancestors, though they've had fire, they've had flame like this, and it's been used for more than 1.5 million years. Nobody made it like that until like 1940. Now, our oldest direct ancestors that we know for a fact were our direct ancestors were Homo habilis. Homo habilis goes back about 2 million years. They did not use fire that we know of. If they did do stuff with fire, it was things like following after wildfires and picking up things that had been cooked. They still kind of lived in trees. They didn't really use fire. We get to Homo erectus about 1.5 million years ago. Excuse me, been talking a lot lately. And then we get fire. Now, we don't know when or how Homo erectus first created fire, but we know that they did it. There's a lot of different theories. We think the first use of their fire was following after wildfires and actually keeping that fire alive, keeping the embers, the coals burning. They would actually take, say, like a hollowed out animal horn like this and put coals in it with a little bit of fuel and keep it protected and safe and carry it with them from campsite to campsite so that they could keep that fire going. There are some people that think the very first method of fire starting was the simple rubbing 2 sticks together method. Now, if I do this really, really fast all day long, it'll get warm, but it won't produce enough heat to do anything. The best way to do that is actually to run it like this in what we call a fire plow. Now, I've done that method before. It takes a long time and a lot of energy to press a stick into another stick and form a groove like this to produce enough dust and heat. It's probably the most difficult method there is, but it does work. Now, where our ancestors got really effective at it, and what we think Homo erectus probably figured out how to do, they made some fairly complicated tools. Their hand axes were a style called Acheulean hand axes. They were in use all the way up until we got to making better tools about 300,000 years ago. We think that they probably started a hand drill fire, spinning the spindle in the drill like this. What that allows us to do is put downward pressure, which creates more friction, produces more heat, and to spin this faster than we can slide it back and forth, which also produces more heat. Now, in the movies and TV shows, they like to show us this part going really, really fast and really, really hard, and then bam, there's a fire. It's not how it works. It's a process. It's a multi-step process. The first thing that we have to do is what we call a burn-in. Now, I've done a couple of those. You can see here, we've just got the holes where that spindle starts out, and I'm just drilling a socket, just a little place for that spindle to sit. If I keep doing that in one of those holes, it'll drill a hole all the way through there, but it won't start a fire. It needs that oxygen. Now, by carving a notch in here like that, I allow oxygen to get in there, and it actually produces its own fuel. Now, the woods that I'm using are very soft. The stalk here is from a mullein plant. They get pretty big, and you'll recognize them very easily. They have big light green leaves, and they're fuzzy. They're really soft. People sometimes call them woodsman's toilet paper, but they're actually a medicinal plant that was imported from Europe. So if you're using mullein stalks, you're actually removing an invasive species from the environment, helping local prairie plants out and making your fire. Mullen's neat stuff. It's very, very fluffy. You know, it's always fun to find. But it works very well for this stock because it has a hard shell. So it can take a lot of pressure as I'm spinning it. But the inside of it, show you on a bigger one here, is kind of styrofoamy. If the camera will focus for me. There we go. It's kind of styrofoamy. And that allows it to hold and build up a lot of heat. And that's important because to get an ember, to get a tiny hot little coal, just like what we'd roast marshmallows over, except much smaller, about the size of a pea, we have to get that point of contact, the friction point, over 800 degrees. Now, that notch, I'm going to tell you how to get that, and then we're going to actually see if we can get this to work. The way I always explain that notch is if you look at your burn spot as a whole piece of pie, you know, an entire pie fresh out of the oven, and you want to slice a pie, you cut it into 6 pieces, even sized pieces, and you take one of those pieces out for yourself. That's the notch that you're going for. And the notch doesn't have to necessarily go all the way to the center. It's just got to go in there far enough that the dust that we create as we grind through there will build up in the notch. That's the fuel. You're actually grinding sawdust out of your hearthboard, out of this bottom piece of wood, while you're creating your friction. Now, the type of wood here is important too. You don't want something that's hard, say like a shovel handle. It's made out of hickory or ash. That's way too hard. You'll never make the sawdust with it. This is a piece of cedar. Things like willow tree roots and cottonwood roots, cedar tree branches will work. Pine usually has too much sap and it gets slippery. It won't get hot enough. There's too much lubrication. You don't get the friction you need. Sometimes it can work if you get the right piece, but it's not great. Driftwood is another good option. If you can get it really dry, you have to have less than 10% moisture content in this. It's a very, very dry piece of wood. And this hand drill technique is actually usually a desert technique. Now, we're going to fold up. Actually, we're going to take a smaller piece of birch bark here. I'm going to angle the camera down so that you can see this. And there we go. All right. Now, to keep everything from flying around, I'm going to stand on this, which is where the funny camera angles come in, because I need 3 hands or, toe thumbs to do this. Now, we're going to take our spindle that's already prepared and put it right on the hole where the notch is already cut. To cut your notch, of course, you just need your handy dandy sharp piece of rock. And before we start trying to make a fire with this, we're going to warm it up. Now you can see as I'm going back and forth here, I'm rocking my hands. Think like itsy bitsy spider. If you get good with that, if you practice a lot, you work your way down the spindle, you can actually move back up so you don't have to stop spinning to get back to the top. A lot of times you'll see people go down to the bottom and do this. That's fine too, but every time you stop, it starts to cool down. Remember, we're heating this up from room temperature. Excuse me. From room temperature all the way up to 800 degrees. Now you might be able to see as I'm doing this, I'm getting a little bit of powder in there. That is a good thing. That's important. And it's starting to get smoke. A little bit of smoke doesn't mean that you're ready yet. It just means you're getting good heat. You got to build up enough of a dust pile that we have fuel for our ember before we really start pushing on it hard. There we go. Now we've got our dust. I'm gonna give it a lot of heat. A little bit more heat. I stopped too early. Now we gotta get it hot again. All right. Ah,
What does fire have to do with fossils?
well, fire is a very, very important part of our past. Excuse me. Now, starting about 1.5 million years ago, our ancestors, pre-human, called Homo erectus, started cooking their food regularly. Now, prior to that, most of our early ancestors actually had fairly strong jaws, a lot like a modern chimpanzee. If you put your fingers up to the sides of your head and move your jaw like this, you can feel your jaw muscles. Your jaw muscles are very, very small relative to most other animals, particularly animals that eat meat. That is because humans, like us, have been cooking our food since before we were actually humans, for more than 1 million years. Understanding how our earliest ancestors were able to do things like make fire not only tells us a good bit about how we evolved, but it tells us how our ancestors were able to survive Ice Age winters. It shows us how they used fire in their everyday lives as a tool. And it tells us things, helps us understand things that fossils can't show us. So learning these skills tells us very important things about where we come from as a species. All right. Started up a lot easier last night. All right, well, I think I've actually worn my spindle down enough that it's not gonna take for me. But that's all right, because that brings us to the local version of this. As you can see, that's a lot of work. Even in really good conditions here in the inside, it still didn't quite go for me. We got pretty close, but not quite. Now, that's an important problem with the hand drill. So Homo erectus, the first of our ancestors to start making fire that way, they lived in a very hot environment. Now, humans, even today, are still really tropical organisms. We're tropical animals. If you think about winter, we all wear a winter coat, right? We go out into the outside in the middle of winter in nothing but our swim shorts, and we'll actually die within like an hour, very, very quickly, because it's so cold outside. Now, the cold wasn't an obstacle to our ancestors spreading over the entire world because they could produce fire. But this is not a good method for producing fire here in Wisconsin. And in fact, this is very rarely used in places like Wisconsin. For the most part, folks around here and throughout most of Europe and into Asia, we're using a tool set like this. Now, this set works on exactly the same principles, but it's much more complicated. This is what we call a compound system. And compound tools are important because they represent a different type of thinking in human evolution. It's not just how much force can I put onto the thing with my hand? How fast can I do the thing and how hard can I do it to make it work? It's not how far can I take and throw this spear just with my arm. It's making a tool to make that spear go farther, to make that fire start easier. Now, this is what we call a bow drill. And your bow doesn't have to be flexible. It doesn't have to be curved. You can make them even out of a large rib bone. And, it's not a bow like a bow and arrow bow, right? Doesn't work very well for that. But what it does is allow me to much, much more easily spin that spindle by drawing the bow back and forth. And with the use of a bearing block, in this case, a rock with a little bit of a hole in it to push down on the back, it allows me to put more downward pressure, produce more friction, more dust, more fuel faster and much easier. Well, that friction board, that hand drill set, can't have a moisture content over 10%. This is a lot more forgiving. Even though it's wet and slushy and cold outside right now, I could take this outside and still get it to work if I can find a dry patch of ground to put it down on. And we're going to demonstrate this here. Now, this takes a different kind of approach than the hand drill. There's a little bit more of a technique to it. You can see my oil lamp is still going over here. Almost out of fuel though. Now, we've still got our dust saved up from the hand drill, but that's okay, because this is going to produce the same kind of dust. I'm going to do this differently here. I'm going to stand on my hearth board much closer to my notch. I'm actually going to make that notch just a little bit bigger. There we go. I'm going to stand on it right there. Now we take the pointy end that we want to do the heating, we point it up and twist that so that it's on the outside of the string. That's going to go on our setup notch there. And I'm going to hold the bearing block in my left hand, work the bow with my right hand. I want my hand braced up against my leg. Now, when I push down on this, I'm not pushing very hard, and I'm using my leg to keep it steady. Because if I don't have it braced, it's going to go like this every time I move the bow. And it gets to be really difficult. Your spindle will fly out of your little socket, and you won't get your fire going. Now, I don't need to move this very fast. I don't need to do this very hard. Oop. Now, if that happens, so remember I said we're using very soft wood. It actually took too much pressure Here we go. You can see the camera will focus for us. Come on, camera. There we go. We can see this was the hole I was using. Right here and here, there's that fresh wood. It actually broke the notch out. That's pretty easy to do if your starter hole is a little too close to the edge. So if you are doing this at home, if you're trying this out and experimenting, it's very likely that that'll happen. All you got to do is set up a new notch, a new hole, and try again. Now, sometimes this will work right away. Sometimes you can do it for an hour before you finally get your fire. And sometimes it just doesn't like to work at all. Ah. All right. We got what we're looking for here. Get this. There we go. All right, or it won't fall off. All of that friction work is for that little tiny glowing speck. Yeah. Here, get the camera to cooperate with us a little bit here. Now, after all that work, we gotta put that out. Oh, it doesn't want to go out. There we go. Okay, because we're not going to light the museum on fire. Now, as I'm sure that made perfectly obvious, even when you know how to do it, you know what you're doing, you can still make mistakes, you can still have problems. That chip of wood that split out actually made both of those notches really difficult to use. And I can probably reshape those so that I can use them and make a fire with them again in the future. But they're really kind of difficult to use because that spindle, as you're pushing it back and forth, it wants to pop out. And that's what happened twice. The second time it happened just after we got that 800 degrees. We got it hot enough to make our ember. So it really does take a lot of practice. It's really a tricky thing to do. Now, one of the absolute coolest ways out there to light a fire, something that our ancient ancestors didn't actually discover until they got up into Europe. And what's really neat, not only did Homo sapiens, our ancestors, do this, but Neanderthals did too. They didn't get this method until they got up into Europe, because this type of rock doesn't exist in a lot of places. This fancy little stone is called marcasite. It doesn't look like much, just as a camera will cooperate with me here. But if we turn this around, the inside is metallic crystal. It's made of what's called iron sulfide. And iron sulfide reacts with oxygen. Now remember, fire is an oxidizing process. It's oxygen reacting with fuel very, very quickly. That produces heat. If we take this broken open iron sulfide stone, this marcasite, and we hit a piece of flint on it, it will actually spark. The sparks are very dull, dim, hard to see. So after a lot of time, starting about 2.5 to 3,000 years ago, people learned to refine iron and steel a little bit, and they started making things like this. Now, if any of you have ever been to like a rendezvous or reenactment, or sometimes even in like medieval movies, they'll show this tool. This is a fire steel or a flint striker, and take our piece of flint. This does the exact same thing. It's just more refined, so it does it a little bit better. And you can see it. Now, our early European ancestors were taking this marcasite and flint, and they were using it to get that ember. The nice thing about this, although it can take a while because it's a very, very dull, light spark, it's not a very hot spark. They can get rained on all day long, get this soaking wet, go into the cave or into the hut, and then hit that together and get a spark right away. So even though it can take them a little while doing this to turn that spark into an ember, like what we just got with the bow drill, this allows them to survive Ice Age winters with the guarantee of fire. Now, it's a little bit more complicated than just getting a spark and starting a fire with an ember. You have to have some special ingredients to catch a spark. Now, the first thing is some kind of really good tinder. Now, this is a fancy sort of a mushroom. It looks like this when it grows on the outside of a birch tree, just a black, brown, woody lump. But if you break it open, it's bright orange inside. This is called chaga. It's a good fungus to know, because chaga is an excellent fire catch. Now, let's see what we can do with the flint and steel so that everybody can see this here. We're going to take a little piece of chaga and see if we can get a good spark on that. Oop. See if I can not drop it. There we go. Usually I would use a bigger piece, but like I said, no fire drills in the museum today. So we're going to use just a little piece. Stubborn little piece. Wow. Boy, my village would be getting pretty cold by now, wouldn't it? Having rough luck starting fires today. Usually, with chaga, the problem is putting it out, not getting it to start up. Wow. Well, like I said, usually the problem is getting this stuff to extinguish, not getting it to ignite. Gonna have to check my tinder, make sure it hasn't been dripped in or something overnight. Now, if we get this stuff to actually light, which Again, I've never actually had it not light. It's kind of interesting. We can't just put that into a pile of wood and turn it into a flame, turn it into fire. We need tinder. We need stuff like this. Now, because fire needs fuel, it's produced with heat, but it has to start out small. You know, you can't just take a lighter or a candle and use it to light an entire log. So while you're wandering around the Ice Age landscape, you're looking for stuff like this. This is the foamy, kind of soft, spongy inside of a gourd. And this stuff, it looks like a hairball out of the drain. It's all plant fiber. It's all stuff from the stems of plants. It's cotton balls. It's seed puff. If you're trying to experiment at home and get yourself a fire going, you can take string, like this is just jute bundling twine, and you can actually unravel it and pull out all of those fibers from the string, and it's that same stuff. You get a good bundle of that. You shape it just like a bird nest. So you've got a little depression in the center. You'd take your coal, your lit ember, whether it's from your bow drill or your spark, hold it like that. I like to use a piece of birch bark or aspen or some kind of bark to hold onto it to help keep my hand from catching on fire. And you give that oxygen, you give it a lot of air, and it will start to smoke and get hot. You'll see it start to really glow and throw out sparks, almost like a sparkler. And then once you hit that 800-degree mark, that will be a handful of fire, which of course you quickly want to set down on the ground. Once you've got that, you can start adding your kindling, your smaller sticks. And once those are burning, you can add bigger and bigger sticks until you've got your logs and you're full on fire. Now, we have a couple other methods to look at here, because more recently, our rather industrious early ancestors in East Asia and in the Philippine Islands came up with a really phenomenal way to start a fire. Now, this is really a very modern version of that was made for me by a very good friend. This is an awesome tool called a fire piston. The very earliest examples of these were actually made out of bamboo. And it works by taking your piece of tinder, your little bit of fuel, putting it in the piston on the end there, and then it uses compressed air to create so much friction and so much heat that it makes a tiny little explosion. And that actually lights the tinder, or lights your fuel, gives you your ember. We're going to give this a try with some of that tinder fungus that wasn't working for the spark and see what we can do. Oh, I had it, didn't stay. Oh, that might just be some bad chaga. I've never had that happen before. Yeah, let's try a different piece of that. That's going to bug me. Keep an eye out for that stuff all summer long because it always lights. And now I seem to have gotten the only piece in the forest that doesn't have any fire in it. All right. There we go. Kind of a neat trick, huh? Now, of course, want to put our ember out. Finally got one to light, and we got to put it out right away. Now, This is a really neat tool. Like I said, the very first of these were made out of bamboo. They would take a smaller piece of bamboo that fits into a slightly larger one. They'd put a gasket on it, make it airtight, and then actually hit the thing with a rock or a stick. And that pressure, that sudden intense buildup of air pressure, creates so much heat. It can get over 1,000 degrees in there for just a split second. But that's just enough time if your tinder is prepared properly that you can light stuff right on fire straight away. And these, again, they're like the flint and steel. They're a method that if this gets wet, that gasket is sealed with animal fat. It's an airtight chamber, and that's all that it needs. It gets so hot, so intensely, so quickly that even if this is rained on all day, if I fill this up with water and pour it out and have a good piece of dry tinder, it'll still work right away. Now, of course, it's a little tricky to make one of those while you're wandering around out in the woods, but people actually figured out how to do that, how to make those out of natural materials from their environment. It just took them a little bit of time. And there's several other methods of fire starting that are a little bit obscure, a little bit more difficult depending on where you are. There's things called a fire thong, which is actually where they take a vine and use the vine to make the friction, running it back and forth across their board. There's methods called a fire saw, where they take basically two of these hearth boards and run them back and forth across each other to get their friction. It's something that's really well worth looking into. Of course, in the modern world, you're probably, if any of you have watched survival shows and Discovery Channel, that sort of thing, you're probably familiar with this sort of thing. This is called a ferro rod or a ferrocerium rod. This makes sparks that are about 2,000 degrees. They're very, very bright. Again, it's something that's waterproof, that's really portable, but it is purely a modern invention. It's actually, believe it or not, what gives you the spark on a lighter. You can see the little sparks come off of there, which again is a thoroughly modern invention. If you want to experiment with some of these, you want to figure out how the ancestors did it, I strongly suggest starting out looking for friction fire materials. It's a lot of fun. It's really difficult, as I fully demonstrated here, but it's worth doing. And you don't need more than a couple of sticks and a rock to get started. Now, my rock here for the notches. We didn't spend much time on this because it does take a few minutes. All I did with the edge of that rock is saw this out like so. And once that rock cuts your shape in, then it should work. Like I say, should, because you guys actually got to see some stuff they didn't see with last night's program, where it worked right away last night. I had some serious technical difficulties with this today, which actually brings us to the last part of fire production here. You saw this is stuff I can pick up from the environment. This is stuff I find when I go to parks, when I take walks in the woods. This is stuff that I build with broken rocks, but it's not 100% reliable. If I get my fire going and I'm, an Ice Age hunter out on the hunt looking for a gigantic woolly mammoth, or I'm moving the village from one camp to another, say fishing camp to berry picking camp, I'm going to want something like this. Or this. I'm going to put fuel in this. I'm going to put a little bit of mud or clay in the bottom and on the sides so that my container won't catch fire. I'm going to put green leaves down on the bottom to help keep that container safe. I'm going to put coals from my fire in here. I'm going to put a little bit of fuel on them to keep them hot, keep them smoldering, but I don't want them to actually light. I'm going to carry this with me. In fact, one of the best preserved, I guess technically Stone Age people ever found, is called Utsi, is the Iceman. And he had a copper axe, but he was at the very end of the Stone Age. And on his backpack were 2 bark baskets made out of birch bark, made out of this stuff, that actually had coals in them. He had in his belt one of these Marcasite fire starters in his little pocket. So he was able to start a fire wherever he got to, but he was carrying his coals with him. He carried that started fire with him because it's really difficult to start a fire with primitive means, even if you've been doing it for a lifetime. You know, I've been starting fires this way when I go camping for probably longer than some of you have been alive, but it's still hard to do. So the best skill to learn if you want to go full-on caveman and do some experimental archaeology is actually how to carry your fire from home and keep it with you safely. And again, fire safety, parental supervision, all very important. Have lots of water, because the first time I tried to move fire in a bark basket on my canoe, I caught my canoe on fire. So we don't want to do that. It's a very bad, embarrassing thing to see the front of your canoe catch fire. So now I know we're coming up close to the end here. Do any of you have any questions about any of this, or like to see some of it a little bit closer up? I see some funny faces. I don't see any questions though. So, all right, well, that's all right. Now, since this didn't work the first time, we do have a couple more minutes. So we're going to try one more time to get that ember with the hand drill, because it's really an impressive thing when you get it to work. And just for my caveman credit here. Oh, from Ziggy. Go ahead. What's your question there? Ziggy.
Why is fire an important part of our past?
Well, see, like I mentioned, it gets cold outside in the winter. Fire keeps us warm. Fire allows us to cook our food. It's a tool that we can actually use to carve and cut things, to harden spear points, to make glue. Fire is one of the top 3 most important inventions of all time. The 3 most important things human beings have ever invented, the 3 technologies that have allowed us to build every single thing that we have in the world today, including the computers that we're talking on right now, are a sharp edge, which allows us to cut and shape hard materials, string, which allows us to bind things together, to sew things, to build things, to make tools, and fire. It allows us to light up the night, to scare off predators, to keep ourselves warm during Ice Age winters, to feed ourselves food that won't make us sick. Because of course, if you eat raw meat, you can get very, very sick. Depending on where you are in the world, you can get parasites, you can get bacterial infections or viral infections. If the meat is old, if it's sat for more than a couple hours, it can make you very, very sick. So cooking it makes it safe to eat. And all of that's very important. Without that, we would not have actually evolved into the species that we are today. We would either have gone extinct or we would look very, very different. So fire actually shaped what we are as a species and all of our technologies in a very big way. All right, let's try this again here. A fire is really one of the defining features of what makes us human. You know, no other animal in the fossil record, no other creature throughout the history of the planet has made and tamed fire and used it as their own tool. The most intelligent animals other than human beings are the great apes, and they're actually afraid of fire. They don't use it at all. All right. I feel better now. There we go. Proof, it works. So that's actually an important part of experimenting here. So what I actually did, I used a different spindle. This one's a little bit longer and a little bit wider. That allowed me to push down a little bit harder and actually keep it spinning a little bit longer. And that made the difference. So like I mentioned, if you try this stuff, experiment a little. It may not work the first time. In fact, it probably won't work the first time. It does take practice and some finagling and trying stuff out. For materials, because this stuff is mullein, it's that soft fuzzy leaves. There's other things that will work out there. This is actually from a goldenrod flower. And it's that same pithy styrofoamy center. Get the camera. There we go. You see, this one's actually a little bit hollow, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. If you find a plant stem that's super, super hollow, that can be, you won't have enough in there, enough fuel. That can make it more difficult, but something that's still got mostly a foam core like this, that's maybe a little softer, will still work. You just got to make sure that you got all of the bark and all of the splinters and stuff off the outside. Because if you're doing this on a piece of wood that's still rough on the outside, you can actually hurt your hands. You can get blisters and scratches and stuff like that. You definitely don't want that. There we go. Let's see. It produced a good bit of dust with just a little bit of effort there. I actually just found this on a walk a couple days ago. So all the stuff you need is out there. Just takes a little bit of practice. There we go. Now, we've kind of done a really brief overview of how some of this stuff works. Now, because I'm inside, of course, I can't demonstrate this to completion. I can just show you the embers and try not to set off the smoke detectors. If you are on YouTube, there are a couple of channels, some really good fellows that I've talked to that have complete comprehensive videos on how to do stuff like friction fire and how to do marcasite. Now, the first one is a channel called Ancient Craft. The experimental archaeologist who runs it is a British fellow named James Dilley. Very, very nice guy. He has videos not only on flint knapping, making stone tools, but a complete how-to with one of these marcasite fire starters. He's actually from the part of the world where these were a common way to start fires up until more recent history. The other channel that does these is a channel, it's Will Lord Prehistoric Survival. Will Lord is another English guy, very, very nice guy. He actually sells these, if I remember right. But he has a couple of videos that show how these are used and even shows the context of how they were used. And for friction fire, a fellow named Tyler White has a YouTube channel called TJack Survival. He has a lot of bushcrafting and survival videos, but he did a multi-part series that he goes through every single step of making a friction fire, making the toolkit, making the tinder, and then showing how it all goes together and how to use it from start to finish. It's a very, very good series that demonstrates this outside, so he can actually show you how to take that ember through the tinder into a fire, where I'm a little bit limited on the museum here because fossils and fire is a bad combination. So I hope that gives a couple of you some resources, some options if you want to look into this type of skill set further. So, all right, I know we're right up at the end here. Was there any more questions real quick before we call it a day?
Question, what was the second one? Will Lure?
Will Lord, Prehistoric Survival. And I'm working on getting a list of recommended books and helpful websites together that we can post up for folks to just go right to the links. The good information can be kind of hard to find, but it's absolutely out there. The trick is if you start watching one of these survival shows like on Discovery Channel, and they go from rubbing two sticks together to sitting next to the fire, you know they edited out about 6 hours of hard work. I guess there's only 45 minutes after commercials to really show them doing it, but they really go to town with the cutting room floor. So, all right. Well, thank you everybody for joining us here. Thank you for giving me a second chance with the hand drill here and proving that does in fact work. It was bothering me a little bit. Again, I hope you learned a little bit of something from this. What our ancestors had to go through, had to work with to actually get a fire going. And like I said, give it a try. It probably won't work the first time you try it, but keep at it. Check out some of those channels. It's a lot of fun. It's a great way to show off and impress and amuse your friends. And it makes those marshmallows absolutely worth it when you finally get there. So thanks again, everybody. And we'll see you for the next program. Right. Bye, everybody.